My name is Renata de Luan. I'm the Deputy Director here at Chatham House, and we're really delighted to have you here with us today for our panel discussion on a seat at the table, why inclusivity matters in global governance. Now, to some extent, this question might be an obvious one. We've never seen the scale of global challenges that we face today and the range of different actors that are participating in solutions to them, whether that's from climate action and environmental campaigns, where we've seen huge transnational movements, to issues around social justice and combating racism. We've seen it in questions around digital technology governance, the role of the private sector, and indeed, we've seen it hugely in the COVID pandemic and the search for solutions and the attempt to cope and manage with the pandemic, the role that so many actors have played below the state level, whether that's cities, whether that's volunteer groups, whether that's scientists, whether that's companies or experts. So we're at a moment where, to some extent, the notion of tackling any global challenges without a very wide set of participation has never been clearer. But we're also at a moment where there's contest over the rules, the institutions, the forums, and the mechanisms for global governance. We see that tension between states. We see that tension between states and non-state actors. And we see that in our local societies and our frameworks, in even our subnational governance, debates about who's at the table, how they're at the table, and what are the mechanisms and the most efficient and effective and legitimate ways of our addressing our global challenges today. So we have this fabulous panel. We're going to be bringing people in from around the world to discuss these questions. But we want also to make sure that you engage in our questions today. This event is on the record and it is being recorded. You'll be able to watch it on our Chatham House website afterwards. And if you'd like to join our questions, enter our debates, please join us at Slido. The directions are there. You can use the QR on your phone, or you can join us at the website and type in the hash CHIGI to join us and pose your questions for our discussion today. In order to get our discussion moving, we'd like to get your views too on the first question of perhaps the day. So you'll see that there on our slido.com. What are the greatest barriers to inclusive participation in global governance today? Over the course of the discussion today, we'd invite you to offer your thoughts on that, contribute in whatever ways you can, and your perspectives, your priorities, and we'll come back to that question at the end of the session. Now, let me move on to introduce our panels and our speakers today. You know, when Chatham House, in its celebrating its priority, or its centenary years, last year, 100 years of Chatham House, we decided to put as a priority this very question about what's the future of participation in global governance and what are the different pathways and options that we can identify and find to make our institutions, to make our global governance more inclusive, more legitimate, and more effective. You can find some of those insights on our report, Reflections on Building More Inclusive Governance. But today we're joined by 4 people from around the world who've spent their lives looking at that question and tackling that question in very different sectors and in very different forums. So I'm delighted to welcome, in no particular order or alphabetically perhaps, first Henriette Esterhuizen from South Africa. Henriette is a civil society advocate on digital governance who is currently serving as the chair of the multi-stakeholder advisory group of the United Nations Internet Governance Forum. So Henriette, welcome today. And if you have your video off, I know it's only just because of low bandwidth, so we look forward to seeing you. We're also joined by Akansha Gurung from London. Akansha is the Communications, Media and Outreach Officer on the Y7 Implementation Task Force for the G7. It's the forum and the mechanism that brings youth delegates and youth voices to G7 leaders for the G7 summit that will take place later this year in London, in Cornwall actually, but in the UK. We're also joined by Sophie Punta from the Netherlands. Sophie is Managing Director of Policy at We Mean Business, which is a global nonprofit coalition working with some of the world's most influential businesses to take action on climate change and to drive the transition to a zero carbon economy. Sophie's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Urban Mobility Transitions. And last but by no means least, we don't want this to be a whammo, we're joined by Volker Turk, who is Assistant Secretary General for Strategic Coordination at the Executive Office of the Secretary General of the UN in New York. Volker comes to us from a world and for many, many years spent working on global refugee problems and challenges, and indeed led in the development of the Global Compact on Refugees and the I Belong campaign. So you'll see it's a super rich panel with perspectives from very many different ranges of the world, and I'm looking forward very much to your thoughts, your perspective, and your questions to them today. But we'll get stuck straight in, I think, so that we can make the most of our time. And I'm going to start with you, Volker. Volker, the UN marked its 75th anniversary in September last year. And as part of that, you did a big crowdsourcing exercise all over the world, asking people about their views and their perspectives and priorities for the UN. What do you think are your priorities, having received that feedback, to tackle the challenges of inclusivity? And what are the key areas and opportunities that you see in the work you're doing now to develop the Secretary General's report, Our Common Agenda?
Well, thanks very much, Renata, and it's great to be with all of you, and really big congratulations to Chatham House for, first of all, having this panel, but also for having done this report on inclusivity and governance, because for us who are now preparing the report of the Secretary General on the Common Agenda, this is extremely important, and you shouldn't be surprised if we are using and plagiarizing some of your thoughts in it, because it's very thorough work and very much welcome from our perspective. I think there's hardly any discussion today that doesn't start with COVID, and it's a bit unfortunate that during the 75 years anniversary, we also were faced with one of the biggest crises that the UN has faced since the beginning, the COVID pandemic, which not only had incredible health implications, but also, as you know, socioeconomic implications, and even on the peace and security front. So I think both of these challenges have come together. As you mentioned, the UN undertook one of its broadest listening exercises that was ever done in its history, despite the pandemic and despite the fact that everything had to be done virtually. And there was almost an opportunity in the crisis, because it allowed, probably through digital means, to reach a much wider group of people, and a very important one. I think there are a couple of lessons learned from COVID that speak directly to inclusivity. One is that everyone around the world felt vulnerable. And that's not often the case. I mean, we know so many people in crisis situations, they have learned to live and to survive with vulnerability and risks. This isn't necessarily the case for many people in the industrialized world or in the global north. And somehow the pandemic has made that equal to everyone. And I think that was very important, because it also showed that we are all in the same boat. We're just doing different functions, but we are actually all sharing the same fate, the same planet, the same life in terms of what we're trying to achieve. So I think that was an important realization, and we hope that that realization also leads to a little bit building more trust. And we have seen some of this trust issue really waning, especially at the national level. We often talk, and you have heard the Secretary General speak in the Nelson Mandela speech, for example, or in the gender equality speech that he gave last year, about the need to reinvigorate a social contract between the state, between the governance side and the people. And I think we are giving it a lot of thought. What does a social contract mean? And it immediately goes to meaningful engagement, participation, and inclusivity, because we see that that's the only way to achieve something. And we have seen it both on the environmental front. I'm glad that we will hear from Sophie, because frankly, without the inclusivity, without the young, without the voices of the youth, the Climate Action Summit that took place in 2019 would not have been what it was, which means a real wake-up call to the world, and a very important one. The other aspect is that, frankly, also came out a little bit of this year that was a bit strange for many of us, that at the time when we needed international cooperation the most, it was also questioned the most, not so much by people around the world, but frankly, by some people in political leadership positions. And let's not forget that even at the height of the Cold War, the then Soviet Union and the US managed to eradicate smallpox. Unfortunately, we did not see the same coming together at the top leadership level around the world when it comes to issues of fighting the pandemic. I mean, we see this around discussions of debt, the debt architecture. We see it around discussions even on the vaccine issue and the distribution of vaccines. So I just wanted to mention this. And yet we also know that it was partnership and inclusivity that actually produced a minor miracle in producing the vaccines within a record time. Let's not forget that either. These were some of the incredible results of inclusivity, participation, digitalization, and people coming together. And I know in terms of time, we have a huge opportunity during the 75th anniversary. The member states of the UN managed to agree to a resolution, the UN 75 resolution and declaration, that identified 12 very strong commitments, and it started with leaving no one behind as the first commitment. And they member states asked the Secretary General to come forward with a common agenda report that really shows the way of the future, multilateralism, effective, inclusive, participatory, networked multilateralism, but also what this reinvigorated social contract would actually mean in today's world. And we are working on this as we speak. We have to produce it within the next couple of months. We have benefited from next generation, fairly young people around the world who have come back to us with their thoughts. We have benefited from thought leaders around the world. We have benefited from very intense discussions at the civil society level, but also in informal settings with member states. So all of these different strands will come together to really give the best and synthesize the best thinking that exists today about the future of multilateralism. And it's absolutely clear that inclusivity has to play a very important role. There's no way that any of today's problems can be resolved without the world coming together in an inclusive manner and in a respectful manner, in a manner that reaches out to everyone who can contribute. So I think we welcome very much this discussion and also your reflections on that. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Volker. I appreciate that, and also your emphasis on the question of trust and the social contract being at the heart of understanding of who gets to sit at the table and to do what and how. You mentioned divided states and the divisions between states really hampering some of those questions. Maybe as you get ready to write this report and to share this and discuss it with the member states in September, are there a couple of policy areas where you do see more potential chance for inclusion? Are there one or two that stand out over others?
I mean, I think definitely on climate change and environmental issues, we see much more appetite for that. I think the same and we will hear from Anret on the whole digital side, although it also has to be said that we face an incredible digital divide, and the pandemic has made that even more apparent. I think we also see it, and frankly, that's one of the issues that we as the UN have to deal with, and where we as the Secretariat and as the agencies, funds and programs can make the commitment that we in our own programming, in our own operational activities, that we adopt a very strong participatory and inclusive approach. And we have made a lot of progress over the years in that regard. So in some instances, we call it age gender diversity approach, where we really you're not actually planning things and programs without the people that we have to serve. And just to give you one example, cash assistance. In the past, humanitarian work was done very much as handouts and humanitarian handouts. And we have really learned to respect the agency and the resilience of people, even in crisis situations, and learned that actually cash assistance is the best way to deal with it, because it empowers the people who we are supposed to serve. And that came out of focus group discussions, came out of discussions with different age groups. And I think that shows also the operational capability of the UN to respond precisely to participation and inclusion and building trust with populations.
Thanks so much, Volker. I'm going to keep moving along now to Henriette. And as you said, Henriette, Volker, digital is one of the areas that are identified as a possible space for inclusion. And Henriette, you've been in exactly that space for many years. So share with us your perspective from the Internet Governance Forum about the opportunities and the challenges for more inclusion in governance.
Thanks, Renata. I think a forum such as the IGF, the Internet Governance Forum, which emerged from a UN process, the World Summit on the Information Society in Tunis, in the form of an output document that member states agreed to, the Tunis Agenda, in 2005. I think it's quite a unique forum in many respects, although increasingly we see fora such as this emerging from UN processes. Firstly, I think it requires legitimacy. I think that's been stated already. And I think so whether a forum is multilateral or multi-stakeholder, legitimacy, I think, has become a cross-cutting criteria that has to be met, and it's not always so easy. Secondly, there has to be trust in the integrity of the process, in it not being captured by any particular interest group. And then thirdly, inclusive participation, as you've already stated, and ownership by the participants or the stakeholders in the process. And then next, I think it has to deliver value. It has to deliver value at different levels. The content has to be relevant. It has to also deliver value as a stage or platform for groups to express their concerns. For example, in the Internet Governance Forum's context, for civil society to raise concerns about internet shutdowns, for example, or about structural inequalities that continue to feed the digital divide that Volker was mentioning. And then thirdly, I think it has to deliver value in a more unintended or more difficult to predict manner, the value that comes from being exposed to diverse views, being exposed to learning and sharing and debate in a way that is not limited by the typical multilateral lowest common denominator constraints. So many fora where governments have to negotiate agreements and suffer from the stress or the pressure of having to come out with agreement, which means you often come up with agreements based on a lowest common denominator outcome, as opposed to a more holistic or in-depth engagement with the issues being discussed. Then next, I think it does need institutional capacity. And I think that's something that's sometimes underestimated when we look at creating these inclusive policy processes. They need to be more than events. They need capacity, they need analysis, and they need enough institutional presence and ability to also grow and evolve. Now, if I had to reflect on how the IGF has rated on or scored against these criteria, I think the legitimacy is an interesting one, because I think the fact that it is an outcome of a UN process, that it provides this crossover between a multilateral process and multi-stakeholder processes, I think is very significant. So it has the legitimacy of being the outcome of an agreement by member states, but it also has the openness of multi-stakeholder and inclusive. So that is a criterion, I think, gives the IGF than many of the internet policy fora that are not linked to the United Nations. For developing country governments, that connection with the UN system, which is still, I think, the only system where they feel they have a voice at an intergovernmental level, is very important. Then trust in the integrity of the process, trust that there's no capture. I think it's good overall, but there are some tensions. You'll find that governments might feel that the IGF is dominated by civil society, because the massive participants, or the largest percentage of participants, come from civil society. And you might find some sectors of civil society feeling is dominated by big internet multinationals. So there's tension in that, but actually I think that tension is par for the course, because I think that has to engage the tension that does arrive from the fact that there are different interests in the real world, and they will be reflected in a policy dialogue space. In terms of inclusion, I think IGF has also succeeded and done well through its structures, the multi-stakeholder advisory group members, who are individuals from different stakeholder groups, including governments, appointed by the Secretary General. But there are also challenges. And I think for me, that is the fundamental point about inclusion. And we can never take it for granted. You have to analyze power differentials. You have to be aware of exclusion at all times. And I think in the IGF, we need to do that more consistently and more effectively. In other words, I think the path to effective inclusion is by constantly engaging exclusion, being aware of it, and interrogating how these power dynamics of inclusion and exclusion play themselves out in your forum. And this is not a static process. I think the IGF has delivered value over time. And I think that it can continue to do so. I think COVID, for example, has raised issues which can really be discussed in a forum like the IGF, where you have different stakeholder groups. We have business and government, we have public health sector stakeholders, and people working in civil society at the cutting edge of exclusion, not having access to the internet. So it has delivered value at that level. I do think that what the IGF needs more of is institutional capacity to hold all of this together and to lead the growth and evolution of a forum like this, if it were to continue to be effective. And then finally, and this is my final point, I think for a multi-stakeholder forum to also be effective, ultimately, it needs to connect effectively with decision-making fora, with the multilateral system, but also with national level decision-making processes, including those led by government. And I think to negotiate and manage that interchange between the open multi-stakeholder bottom-up process and the more traditional government-led intergovernmental or national decision-making processes, that requires work, it requires capacity, it requires investment of time and resources. And I think that is where I would like to see the IGF grow in the future.
Thanks very much, Henrietta, and thanks in particular for making this point about the link between multilateral forums and multi-stakeholder forums, and how multi-stakeholder forums, their legitimacy can be enhanced by that linkage to multilateralism, but also that there is a constant interplay about how do they interact, where do they exchange, and how do they influence. If you're still there and you can still hear me, I would just be interested in one particular question, Henrietta. Large forums like Internet Governance, IGF, they favor institutions that can travel. They favor institutions that are well organized, the civil society actors that can move. And many of those, not all of them, but many of those civil society actors live in or are based in Northern or Western European countries. So to what extent or to what efforts is the IGF making to support capacity building of civil society participants from outside, let's say, the global north, that not very helpful phrase, but to look at a more ensuring that that is really enabled? Are there mechanisms to support participation, engagement, and capacity?
Yes, in fact, I think that has been an IGF success story. I think I'm not saying there are not global North, global South imbalances. I think you see that reflected in the IGF because the internet industry and internet infrastructure and capacity is very much concentrated in the global North. But I think what the IGF has done is to evolve over time national and regional and youth IGF initiatives. And these are decentralized, they are local, they're self-organized. Some of them have very active participation from national government, some not. In an authoritarian regime, you would have less civil society involvement than in a non-authoritarian regime. But that decentralized process, so these are events that take place throughout the year. There are now about 140 of these around the world, and then they feed into the global process. So this is almost an even more democratized version of the old UN PrepCom. Some of you would remember how UN summits were built in a bottom-up way through regional PrepComs. In a way, this achieves that. And then I think the fact that it is virtual and that participants are using online fora. In fact, the 2020 Internet Governance Forum was probably one of the most inclusive ever because it was held virtually. So yes, I think the IGF has done quite well in overcoming those barriers. But again, as I said, inclusion should never be taken for granted. You need to continuously be aware of how the exclusion is playing itself out in order to address it then in a very deliberate way.
Thank you, Henrietta, and that's a good calling card for all our work. Sophie, I'm going to move on to you. You're working in the climate area, where we've seen some of the greater success stories in terms of non-state actors and more inclusive processes shaping multilateral discussions. We've seen that in various COPs. We'd love to hear from you about how that works and what are some of the tactics and techniques that have been effective in that space. Sophie.
Thanks, Renata, and thank you very much for inviting me over today, and really interesting to hear the previous panelists already. Yes, I'd like indeed to zoom a little bit more on climate and particularly on the role of business and how they then relate with NGOs. So rather than, I'd like to just tell the story of how this evolved, right? So We Mean Business was set up as a coalition in 2014. And it was a coalition between various NGOs. We have BSR, the B Team, CDP, CERA, CLG Europe, Climate Group, and World Business Council for Sustainable Development. So there's 7 of them. And the reason why they came together is because of Paris in 2015. They realized that if we all go to Paris and try and influence the Paris Agreement from different angles, the likelihood we get heard is much smaller than if we unite. So what We Mean Business did then is they joined those businesses together. So right now we have more than 1,700 companies in our network that have set science-based targets, have joined the Climate Pledge, have joined initiatives like EV 100, Renewable Energy 100 or others. And then when they went to Paris, they basically developed 8 policy asks, and I still have it. I took it in a previous time when I wasn't even working here, so that means it actually had an impact on me. There were 8 policy asks, ranging from transparency to alternative renewable energy, and those 8 policy asks were then presented in combination with proposed text for what could appear in the Paris Agreement. So you had a united ask, and you had a wording that was already crafted so that negotiators in Paris could easily understand, okay, well, if we were to consider that, how could we then translate it concretely into the Paris Agreement? And that actually worked, because a lot of the Paris Agreement included those policy asks. And what it meant then, that the Paris Agreement was in a way shared and backed by a large part of the business community. And because of that, it will contribute to success later. But also what was important, it was not so much pressuring, government through activism, but rather trying to find a way to help government do it. And I think this is about what inclusiveness is. It's about togetherness, right? It's rather than opposing each other, it's togetherness. How can we feel that we're part of this thing, even though we might be a business or a government or a civil society. Now then we moved on to this year, which is more recent. It was last month, In the US, there was a big climate summit hosted by President Biden. And we felt that over the past years, there was a big backlash there against climate action. And there were 3,900 mayors, universities, businesses, civil society, and others who said, we are still in. We're going to continue on climate action, no matter which way the political wind is blowing. And we came together last March with one ask. President Biden, can you commit to at least 50% emission reduction by 2030? And this was first analyzed by the scientists, World Research Institutes and others to see it's possible. So we knew it was attainable. And they checked that it was in line with Paris Agreement. So they also knew it was achievable, right? And then we put an ad out with 12 NGOs. So here was not just Women in Business, but also World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, and others to say, business, you need to call for good policy on climate, which was then followed by a letter that was signed by 410 businesses that called on President Biden, can you please make this ambitious target? And if you do, we will be more ambitious too. Now, those companies represented 4 trillion annual revenues. It was really a big representation. And the day after our letter came out, scientists published a letter, about 1,500 of them, asking for exactly the same. And again, what happened here, it was not so much that government was pressured, but as John Kerry said then on CNN, you know, when so many businesses are asking for this, when so many scientists are asking for this, you've got to listen. And so rather than pressuring them, they were given the mandate and the backing to call for this ambition, because they knew if we do, we're going to be backed by both scientists and businesses. Now, when we then go into the COP, we see now that the COP this year is very important still, because it is really the one global platform where interaction, negotiation, stock taking can happen. Although what we do see that the relative importance of the COP has gone down a little, really because we see that much more of the focus has to go to implementation. And as a result, we also see that now we're getting engaged in the G7, which is next month, in the G20, which is October, working with national governments and working with other NGOs to try and influence the way that policy is heading, not just at the COP, but in all these events leading up to the COP, year in, year out. And as a final point, I wanted to make that if you see what will happen in the future, the trends are happening that from a global agreement, things are going to translate to national policy. From commitments, it's going to go to action and accountability in addition to that commitments. And finally, we're going to see that climate change is going to be put in a bigger context. So we see with COVID already what's happening. We can't just look at climate in isolation. If we don't have socioeconomic policies that cover all concerns of society, so and pollution and health and the economy, we're not going to make it. It needs to be put into context. And as a result, what we see then, that we need to engage more with partners in different countries and not just at a global level. So we're going to be expanding our network of partners quite significantly to reach out to those who are working in various countries. And it includes the Global South, to make sure that when we move forward to bring businesses together, we look at it from a global perspective, but also from a national perspective. And with that, we get more SMEs involved. And that's where we set up the SME Climate Hub to make sure that also small and medium enterprises can be included. And so finally, I think that we can't do this alone. You need, what your report said very wisely, is you need a fluid mix of coalitions that are pulled together from different stakeholders to supplement, but not replace, the more formal multilateral system. And I think it's exactly that's point number 10 in your report, is precisely that combination that needs to be nurtured to get us to a more sustainable world. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sophie. I mean, I think you've shown us also that some of the strategies are really important for effective impact on global questions. You talked about achievable solutions, finding things that are achievable asks. You talked about communications and having these publicity campaigns, these newspaper ads, these advocacy campaigns. And you also talked about these alliances across the business and the scientific community having joint alliances. But I'm really just maybe as a follow-on question, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how do we ensure the accountability of these non-elected coalitions? There are many coalitions. You're coming together because you've got interests, individual, and you've got commitment. How do we ensure accountability of these leadership forums?
Well, that's a very good question. I sometimes say, you know, there's a death by initiatives, right? There's so many initiatives coming. You sometimes don't know anymore which one's doing what. I think ultimately you have. I think what it needs to be really clear for any coalition or organization, NGO, to be very clear, how do they hold themselves to account, right? And it can be by saying we're looking at the macro level. So what we mean businesses a bit more by saying how many companies can we get to commit to ambitious targets, and how many companies can we then, through, in this case, CDP is our partner who's looking at reporting, also make sure that they live up to those targets. So our role will be in the future much more also working with our partners to track that companies are on track. And secondly, more at a policy level to see, can we attribute some of the policy developments to the role we have played? And then you have a layer underneath it, and that's more like where initiatives or coalitions are more focused on specific solutions, right? So they might say, we're looking at electric vehicles or renewable energy or sustainable buildings or reporting financial information. And they will also be looking at the number of companies that are committed to do it, and then whether they do it, and if they do it along certain criteria. And then the third layer of NGOs is really the concrete. Have we got that electric car on the road? Have we got that steel plant made more energy efficient? Have we got this agricultural farmland done, transferred in a more sustainable way? And that leads to the real on-the-ground emission reductions. And I think what could be improved is that there's more clarity about at what layer different coalitions and initiatives fit, because only then can we also see, are we inclusive enough? Are we not having a top-heavy overarching group of coalitions or initiatives involved, and not enough attention for the ones who are really on the ground working? And they need each other. And I think where now the gap is that sometimes there's a lot of local on the ground things happening. They're super good and are really effective, but they don't see the light of day. So what trick can we apply to pull those up and take those as skills? We don't reinvent the wheel, but we're really seeing the solutions exist. It's a matter of pace and skill, but it's a matter of picking those ones that work and giving them the financing, the capacity, the support to rise it to the level of policymakers or business leaders, and that then make sure that they spread across the world.
Fantastic. So I think that's echoing also Henrietta's point about constantly testing ourselves about inclusion and exclusion, and who's part of the coalition and who's part of the change. Before we move on to our final speaker, just a reminder to colleagues and to the audience, we're looking forward to your questions and comments. Please go on to the slido.com and enter in your questions and comments there. That's where we'll be taking them. So love to hear from you on that. Our final speaker is one who really works on the youth perspective, and in particular, how young leaders can have greater access and influence, not just access, but be listened by global forums and by leaders around the world. So Akansha Gurung, who is working with the Y7 task force. Akansha, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Renata, and thank you so much to the Chatham House team for inviting me to speak today. What an incredible honour, and especially to speak alongside Volker and Sophie. Really lovely to hear your perspectives. So just a little bit about the Y7. So the Y7, the U7, is an official engagement group of the G7, the Group of Seven, and they meet annually to agree on international policy. And this year, the UK, where I'm from, is hosting the G7 summit in Cornwall. Since January, the Y7 has been working incredibly hard by supporting the selected youth delegates from each country, and there are 4 per country, each one representing the 4 different policy tracks. So we have economy, health, digital and technology, and climate and the environment. So, you know, a lot of bases covered. We've held events with experts, ran training sessions, and we even ran public consultations to gauge the opinions of thousands of young people across the 7 countries so they can feed into the policy recommendations that the youth delegates will make to the G7. Just yesterday, we finalised and voted on the Y7 communique, which will be released to the public later this week. This year's Y7 theme is actually future generations. So not just the youth of today, but actually the youth of tomorrow, so that we can ensure that policy is made for those that we leave our world to. And I think young people's voices are so important in global governance because, as I said, we are the people who will inherit the decisions of today. So we deserve a seat at the table. And as Volker said, every conversation that we have will involve COVID. And when we reflect on the past year, so many communities have been devastated by COVID-19 and all the lockdowns that have happened. And I think young people are definitely one of those communities that have really been affected, from mental health issues to job security issues, to online classes really affecting the education system. But despite this, in this past year, it was the passion of young people that really drove the Black Lives Matter movement and the current climate change dialogue. And in fact, when you look throughout history, it is the optimism of young people's vision of a fairer and more equal world that has driven progress in our society. And traditionally, this has been through social movements, civil society, but I think now is definitely now we have definitely earned our right to global governance as well. Beyond having young people's perspectives in policy making being a huge asset, I think in terms of democracy and representation, it is essential to have young people involved. Actually, half of the world's population is now under 30, so we need young people's voices in policy making. And we've seen powerful individuals in huge companies have an influence on policy, and they don't always undergo that much transparency or accountability. So surely citizens such as young people deserve to have influence too. Otherwise, global governance will continue to be seen as just serving states and global elites and being disconnected from those that they are meant to be serving. There has been some positive change, and state actors and global governance institutions have come to realise that there is a change in the dispersion of agency in our world today, and the dispersion of power must reflect that too. So the Y7 is obviously a great example. We also have the Y20, we have youth parliaments, the COP26 Youth Summit, EU Youth Conference. But I highlight 3 main problems with youth involvement in the global governance. So firstly, these platforms need to go beyond just symbolism and superficiality and also focus on inclusion and active engagement, which I know Anret really picked up on. Young people deserve to witness and experience the tangible effects of any policy work they help contribute to. And secondly, these young platforms are typically catered to a certain type of young person, usually from a Western country, English speakers, university graduates, those that have access to the internet. So these global institutions must ensure that the young people that they recruit are diverse, represented, and financially supported throughout their involvement to ease any barriers. And I, of course, myself am a beneficiary of those privileges as someone from the UK with a university degree. But I really want to advocate for all the young people whose accessibility to global governance may be even harder. And thirdly, it is no longer enough to just spotlight a few high-profile youth activists. We need institutional processes in place that allows thousands of young people to contribute their opinions and engage, because this is essentially about collective action and not individual successes. To conclude, without change, global governance will continue to be a distant and outdated system which moves further away from the citizens it's supposed to serve. And I think my message to young people is no more asking permission and no more being apologetic that we're not experienced or we don't have the expert knowledge, because our experiences are unique and so of much value of global governance. Thank you.
Great. And Akansha, I loved very much your point about institutionalization of youth movements and away from the kind of 1 or 2 global youth celebrities around the world, because I think that is also reflective of a much broader audience and engagement. We haven't talked all that much about social media tools. So I'd love to get your perspectives, probably someone who knows them much better than the rest of us.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you see social media as being a vehicle to sort of drive that institutionalization of youth perspectives? Obviously, there is the dark side as well as the positive side. Love to get your perspectives as a youth activist.
Definitely, social media, it's one of the reasons that our world is so fast moving, and there's always changes to social media, and thus there are always changes to the way policies are made and the way people act in everyday life. And actually, one of the benefits of the Y7 is that it is actually run by youth for you. So the implementation task force that I'm part of, we are running all the background work, we are running all the events, and we are also running our social media, because we realize the value of having the tone and the voice in social media to be from the youth. We know what the youth want, we know what attracts the youth. So that's one of the reasons we have young people running the background work, running the social media. And yeah, definitely in the past year, especially, we've seen the Black Lives Matter movement, as I've mentioned, but also the Stop Asian Hate movement. That was all driven by social media, and especially in a year where we're all being virtual, you know, some of us don't have the capacity to go out and physically support in protests, for example. All our support has been through virtual, and I think social media really did drive that forward, and it will continue to drive the way we operate in everyday life.
Brilliant. Thanks, Akansha. We're going to go on now to questions from the audience, and I want to make sure that we have enough time to bring them in, because there's quite a number of questions and some really great ones. So I'm going to start from the one that has so far a number of votes in support of it, and I'm going to direct it, if I can, Volker, to you, which is, many people don't trust global institutions or subscribe to a globalist vision of progress. Is this a problem for the goal of not leaving anyone behind that is so central to the UN's mandate?
No, thanks. I think it's a very important point, and I think one needs to look at it in a much more nuanced way, because if you actually, analyze the results of the listening exercise that took place last year with UN 75, and even some of the barometers, Edelman barometers and others, you will actually see that, unlike at the national level when it comes to state institutions, that people around the world, especially young people, have incredible confidence and trust in global institutions. So the UN, for example, has in a way much more trust benefits than perhaps even at the national level. And that's important, because I think in a way the UN is seen as a progressive agenda, and it's seen as speaking directly to the issues that confront people in their daily lives. I think there's also a tendency by some to discredit global institutions, but often out of a place of ignorance or frankly manipulation. And I think we also need to address it very head on, because we know that there is not one single issue today that can be resolved on its own at the national level. There's not one single issue that doesn't have a transboundary effect. There's not one single issue that doesn't speak to future generations. And I'm very grateful to Akansha to actually have mentioned it's not just about this generation and the young people of this generation, but it's also about young people that are still to be born in this century. And one of our big problems is that policymaking does not necessarily take into account, as a matter of course, the impact that our decisions today have on future generations. And that's incredibly important. And it's definitely one of the areas that we will need to strive to achieve much better in terms of in importance. And it's interesting that courts are picking it up. I don't know, and in a way, I don't know if you saw the German Constitutional Court decision on climate action, which in a way combines the responsibility and legal responsibility of this generation for future generations. That I think was quite a remarkable judgment. And it shows that there is some evolving thinking that hopefully will also then build that trust that is so much needed. But we definitely, anyone today at the most remote location in the world will have to think globally in whatever they do.
Thank you, Volker. Henrietta, and all of you, Sophie and Akansha, you all pointed to this question that We have at the moment global platforms for expression of views, but they need to move to the next step and become governance platforms and with real decision shaping functions and potential. So the question that has come in, Henrietta, about the IGF is, how do we move to a system where IGF has really governance capabilities and real governance capabilities, and a degree of oversight related to technical standards bodies or to norms as they evolve?
Renata, I think well, firstly, I think at a political level, in terms of the perceptions of what the multi-stakeholder process in internet governance is, I think there's been a shift. I think probably for its first 10 years, the Internet Governance Forum was used as a platform for looking for alternatives to governance, alternatives to regulation. And it was very much dominated by a private sector perspective, and a technical community perspective, that regulation wasn't necessary, that self-regulation was sufficient. And I think we've now seen a shift that, in fact, in order to protect human rights and in order to make the digital sphere and the internet more inclusive, we do need policy solutions. So I think that's the first step. I think the first step is to look at multi-stakeholder governance, and a forum like the Internet Governance Forum as kind of a public participation space for looking at what policies we need, what regulation we do need. And to become a policy body or policy making or a regulation formation body itself, I don't think it's necessary. I think the value of the IGF is that it is that open space for public participation. I think, as I said earlier, in order to use this bottom-up inclusive character of the IGF to influence policy, there needs to be closer relationships with the multilateral system, closer relationships with industry bodies, with technical standards setting bodies, and with national and regional policy fora, with telecommunications regulatory bodies, and so on. I think to convert the IGF into a policy-making space, I think could be counterproductive, but to make it a more effective conduit of policy and regulatory ideas and recommendations that have benefited from a bottom-up and open debate, and then to channel that into decision-making fora. I think that is the power of a body like the IGF. And to strengthen those relationships, I think it's not easy to do that. And actually, Volker, I think I would perhaps say be a little bit more pessimistic than you are about the state of confidence in global governance institutions. I think it is not as strong as I would like to be. And I think, yes, there are political agendas that are undermining the international system, but I think the international system itself, the UN including the UN, is struggling with integrating a multi-stakeholder approach, with having a closer relationship with business without at the same time falling prey to accusations of corporate capture, as a space for challenging authoritarian regimes without at the same time being dominated by a few governments. So I do think that the global system is struggling to deal with becoming more inclusive in a way without undermining accountability. Sorry, Renata, I kind of diverged a little bit there at the end.
No, and Henrietta, you diverged right to our next question. So I'll start with Sophie, but if anyone wants to come in on this, which is really this question of how to balance inclusivity with the potential dangers of it being the voice of some, either the wealthiest or the most dominant or the loudest, and how to balance inclusivity with the potential danger of autocratic regimes or even illiberal democracies, of which we are seeing more and more in our world today. Sophie, I don't know if you want to take a run at that, and then
I have a run at that. Although I'm not sure if I want to talk about the authoritarian regimes as such, but let me take the example more from a business perspective, right? What I found very effective is that the moment that you And let me take the ISO as an example, right? Because everybody knows that ISO standards, they're often set up, it's a global body, but they have national representative bodies around the world. And subsequently, somebody even in one country can propose a new standard being needed and get a few other countries to rally behind that. And then they take it up. But usually those standards are already building on something that exists on the ground, right? So to give a really practical example, in my previous job with Smart Freight Center, we worked on a methodology to calculate emissions for freight. And we did this together with business, and we developed what we call a GLAC framework for a methodology that works for business in practice. But of course, it was not business to say this should be a standard or this should be the law, right? That's for others to determine. But by then taking it to the ISO and saying, look, we've got something that works for business in practice. We anticipate that in the future there will be more accountability. And if we get more accountability, carbon price and all the rest of it, it is so important to have one methodology for accounting carbon. Can you make this an ISO? And that's exactly what happens. And so I think where the strength lies in trying to get, say, a bottom-up involvement is, for example, for the UN. I also worked at the UNEP in Bangkok for several years, and the same applied. It's really important for the UN and international development agencies to see what is their role. Their role is really to collate what happens on the ground and bring it into a framework or a standard or policy that works across a broader geographic or sectoral layer. But it is also important to acknowledge that it's not necessarily the UN who can then determine what works and what doesn't. It needs to identify partners who have those feet on the ground, boots in the mud, who can work it out. This is what worked, and now we take it a layer up. And I think the future of the success of future international governments is going to depend partially on that ability to be able to pinpoint to those players on the ground, whether youth, whether farmers, whether women, whether least developed countries, whether in autocratic countries or democratic countries. For me, that's less relevant. It's about how do you pull that practical, on the ground, realistic situation into a more global setting to then make sure it's going to work for everyone. And with that, I do think that for me, multilateral institutions are absolutely critical because my worry is that without it, you're going to get a split of the world in the haves and haves not, in those with the standard, those without, partly because, and I saw everybody putting geopolitics as the biggest barrier for inclusivity, precisely for that. So I think, ironically, it's the multilateral organizations that need to fight most for inclusivity for this to work, because they're the only one that cuts across governance and can make sure everybody gets included.
Thanks for Sophie, and I think we'll come back to that, but I'm going to ask Akansha a variation of that theme that has also come up. I mean, are you worried that preaching, let's say, to use the word in a non-pejorative way, inclusivity and togetherness, does that risk acknowledging and embracing the diversity of actors and the diversity of perspectives around the world? Do you think about that in the context of youth voices and engagement?
Yeah, I think inclusivity is hard because it's important, but sometimes it has the danger of slipping into a tick box exercise. And when I was talking about how a lot of global governance institutions, when they have youth platforms, they normally recruit youth from Western countries, for example. And I would like to advocate for more young people from all over the world, but I don't want them just recruited for the sake of saying, look, we have people from all over the world. I want them to be actively engaged. And so that it's difficult. When I use inclusivity, I always try and include an active engagement because that always needs to follow through. So it is difficult, and having multiple voices in one forum as well. Who is speaking the most? We might have youth from everywhere around the world, but who is directing it, who's leading? That also needs to be checked, and that needs to be accounted for, so that everyone who is recruited has an equal voice and has an equal say in where the policy direction goes.
I think that's
Renata, can I
great.
respond
Henriette, yeah.
I just wanted to, I'm really struck by Akansha's remarks, and I think often, and I'm saying this from a multi-stakeholder perspective, a civil society perspective, I think it applies to multilateral institutions as well. We approach inclusivity as almost a way of preventing dissent, a way of preventing subversion, as opposed to actually a way of accommodating it. And I think what Akansha made very clear in her earlier remarks as well is how actual change often results not from a particularly well-managed, inclusive, multilateral or multi-stakeholder process, but it comes through movement, through protest, through dissent. And I think that is something we have to take into account. Of course, we have to have processes that are structurally inclusive and participative, but I think we also need to be open to acknowledging the dissent, the voices of the excluded, the voices who are not privileged in that particular context. And I think that gives us the more dynamic kind of output that we need to become more inclusive in a holistic way. And I think, I see so much focus on youth inclusion and internet governance processes, and I find them so shallow. It's not actually creating a space where policymakers and practitioners in the corporate sector and in civil society can listen to what it is, because young people have a particular insight and experience of technology. It becomes a way of just making sure that there is a young person in the room, or that there's a capacity building effort, because in that way you can say, we've accommodated the youth, or we've included the youth, rather than actually creating mechanisms for hearing the frustration of youth, or the anger of youth, or the creativity of youth.
Yeah, I think this question is coming through in a lot of the questions about making inclusion more than a box-ticking exercise. And Volker, I wanted to come to you on this question, because it's at the heart of how can the UN take a coherent approach? How can the UN work across all its very different institutions, while at the same time do something more than just be a box-ticking exercise?
I think the discussion that we have just had, Akansha and Ariette, I think it's really a critical one, because I agree that, and sometimes social media haven't helped in that regard. What we see too much when it comes to policy discussion or some of the big issues, that it isn't really a debate where you have policy disagreements worked out. And I think that's really, and we see that at the national level, we see it also at the international level. You actually do need to have a healthy debate where people agree, disagree, where they work it out. I think Henriette was saying that very strongly, and we see this all the time. And part of why populists and populist politics has gained so much attraction is because they are using this to polarize and divide. And we need and inclusivity is precisely the opposite. It is to make sure that people are heard, that we listen to each other, that we understand each other, but that we also then debate based on evidence, facts, and try to find the best possible solution. And it's sort of this collective brainstorming that is required that takes into account that there are diverging views, but at the end of the day, there is a process that tries to identify the best possible way forward. And on this tokenism, which is really also a big concern in when it comes to participation and inclusivity, I think we absolutely need to make a very conscious effort to include people who are directly affected by the decisions that we take, by young people, as Akansha was also saying, that that they are part of the debate. I remember when I was responsible for leading the discussions on the Global Compact on Refugees, we actually included refugees, but member states would not want them to be part of the formal process of negotiating. But what we then did is we had actually refugee participants. In fact, most of them were young refugees, below 30, who would critique our discussion and the member state discussion over lunch hours. And it was interesting because most member state representatives were actually present. They were listening to that critique. And I think it in a way had that impact. We also encouraged, by the way, delegations of member states to include youth representation and refugee representation, because I think one of the big areas that we will need to work on is, and it came very much from the disability movement, is that nothing about us without us. And I think that's really the key of any discussion that we have. And it was probably not a coincidence that the UN 75 declaration at its first commitment has leaving no one behind. We're very interesting that was the first idea that came through. Leaving no one behind means listening, being able to take other points of views into account, and creating the safe space where policy discussions and disagreement can be debated and mediated.
I'm going to keep you while I have you, Volker, because a question came for you. So there's three votes for this particular question, but it's one that gets at what explains the current pushback that we're seeing in some UN forums and amongst some UN member states towards multi-stakeholder participation. Do you see that as any single particular factor driving that?
I mean, I think first of all, we have made progress. I mean, it's always good to start with what we have been able to achieve. I mean, compared to even 10 years ago, I think we have seen a much stronger embracing of multi-stakeholderism. And I know that some of Henriette and others or Sophie, I don't know, and some of maybe not so optimistic, but I do think that COVID and some of the positive aspects of COVID has actually been that multi-stakeholderism, that the fact that you can only deal with big problems if you have everyone on board, and if you embrace inclusivity is the way of the future. I really believe that. I mean, the resistance to it is often fear. The resistance to it has a lot to do with loss of control, has a lot to do with power issues. And I think if the realization sets in that you get more ownership, that you get the best out of people, that you get the best out of products by being inclusive, if that realization can be more evidence-based and through the studies that you are doing, for example, I think that will help. So I think we shouldn't look at it from the perspective of how to confront it, but more how to engage with it and showing the results of inclusivity, of participation in terms of the products that we get.
I think that's really important point, Volker, that's come up in a couple of the questions, which is how do we make the case to show that you get better policy towards inclusion? How do we make the case to say you get more impactful policy towards inclusion? Sophie, is this something you've thought about in the We Mean Business coalitions and in your efforts on climate action?
Yeah, it's about, I think the realization has kicked in that if you want to be successful with climate action, you need to put it in a bigger context. And of all the horrible developments because of COVID and the misery and agony that people have been facing, I think in a way it is also a test case for, are we able to demonstrate global solidarity across, right, to tackle this climate crisis? And I think most businesses know that they need a good working multilateral system for business to thrive and for societies to thrive. I mean, those go hand in hand. The question is rather that where I think the mistrust is coming is if they, for example, see on the vaccine side that it's distributed unequally, is it then more than lip service? Is it really happening? And with that, I think what's also should be taken into account, a lot of these things is uncharted territory. When we started with COVID, nobody knew what the disease was, how to tackle it. We've been learning by doing. I mean, the UK started vaccinating, and luckily for them, it was the right choice, but it could have turned the other way. And the same applies to business if you look at climate change, right? So much is still uncharted territory. And what I wish that people, everyone, would be a little bit more tolerant towards errors being made. You know, it's not about best practices, it's test practices. We know the destination, we agree on that, but we have to acknowledge that we're not going to get it right the right way. When we see with COVID, it's not malintended that those mistakes were made. Very often it was because with the information policymakers, businesses or others had at the time, they made a certain choice. And the same will happen with climate change. So what will be really key is to be genuine. I think that's really important, genuine in and transparent about what your targets are, how you plan to get there, and then, you know, making mistakes along the way and admit to it. But I think the moment that governments and businesses alike would show that they're really genuine about their approach, they'll be forgiven a lot more. And I think that, you know, show the heart, show the real intent, and yeah, I think, and that's what coming to Akansha's point about ticking the box. It shouldn't be a ticking the box exercise. It's much better to be genuine about inclusiveness and making mistakes along the way than trying to get it right. And by doing that, it becomes too forced or too fake, and people see through fake. So
if I could just jump in on that, Renata.
Yeah,
just to say that, just from my perspective of someone who works with the Y7, after the Y7 summit, which we've actually done half of this weekend, we will continue to do this week as well. And after the G7 summit in June, our work doesn't actually stop there. The Y7 is a year-long process. And we actually help the youth delegates and any other young people involved do post-summit initiatives. So they can pick a project or social cause that they care about, and we support them in developing any initiatives that they want to do in that field. Because it's not just about solely on the G7 summit, it's about developing young people in long term, not just a tick box exercise, not just have them present at a summit, show their faces and go. Actually, we want to develop these young people, and we want to give them the empowerment to take what they've learned from their Y7 process to then go out and do more good in the world, hopefully, and be more involved in global governance and other aspects.
Thanks, Akansha. I'm very conscious, Volker, that you're going to have to leave us soon. So I'm going to suggest that we stick up the Slido of the views of the audience that we got as to what their assessment as to the greatest barriers and global participation. And then I'm going to ask you, Volker, to offer any final thoughts, but then I'm going to go to each one of our panelists. But I'm going to leave you with one question I'd also like you to think about, which is, we didn't talk about cities and we didn't talk about local governance, but some of the biggest changes we're seeing during COVID on climate, on issues about fairness, or on issues about inclusion, on race, we're seeing at local government levels. So I'd love to bring in your perspectives of where you see that inclusive level of levels below the government. So I'm going to be giving you two questions, if you don't mind, if I can indulge on you. So maybe we can just share the panel, and we can look that geopolitics is pretty heavy right in there in the center, and then there's capacity, access, and other issues. I'll move to you, Volker. Any thoughts on what strikes you as you see that, and any perspectives on local structures?
No, thanks very much. And I think that's really extremely good to have this. I mean, my own experience, my own life experience has always been to keep a great sense of optimism, because sometimes we can be so easily overwhelmed by issues that are really outside of our control. And I think it's interesting that geopolitics is sort of in the middle. I mean, we are not going to necessarily be able to change the geopolitical side of it. But let's not forget, there are things that we can do on these issues that don't involve geopolitics and that still make the case for it. So we need to identify exactly those areas where we can have influence, where we can make a difference, where we can actually move ahead and move the needle to a much greater ability. And I think also Sophie's point on, you know, the tolerance for error, the fact that we are all trying to make the best out of it, and we are trying to achieve within the whole ecosystem that we live in to make the best out of it, and with a real sense that we can actually do something about it. And despite sometimes this barrage of almost overwhelming things that seem to crush us. There is nothing that crushes us. I think we need to have that sense of empowerment, and I think we have seen it from this discussion as well. On the second point, the local governance issue is an absolutely critical one. And UN Habitat, actually, one of the UN agencies, is working very hard on a system-wide strategy to ensure that, and we have seen it also in our own programming, that we are much more oriented towards cities, networked cities, how they deal with issues. I experienced that myself in the whole refugee context, because we were linking up with cities. When in some instances, countries became much more averse to receiving refugees, you actually often saw the reverse when it comes to cities and mayors. And this open city concept was extremely important. So the UN is very conscious of the fact that cities are often at the forefront of humanitarian action, of environmental issues, of biodiversity, of socioeconomic recovery issue. And we really want to engage with them. There are, again, obstacles that are put to us, including by some of the member states who say that you have to centralize everything and everything has to go through the central government. But I think we have found ways and means to engage with cities nonetheless. And I think the direction of travel is clear on it, and we just have to amplify it and work on it and never give up. Thanks, Renata, for this great discussion.
Thank you so much, Volker. And we know that you have a lot on your agenda with the preparation of our common agenda, the report that the member states have asked the Secretary General to set out the vision for the next 75 years of the UN. So we'll all be looking to see where inclusion fits in that. So thank you so much for joining us. I should note that on this Slido poll, geopolitics is only one more vote, and equal votes are also funding and capacity. So I think that gets to your point, Volker, about what are the practical things we can do, what are the practical tools that we need, and that different actors need to have access to be able to impact change. So I'm going to move now, if I may, to Henriette. Henriette, your thoughts on when you see this, does this ring true to you, but also to your perspectives on where and how local and city and subnational governance can be a part of a more inclusive global public goods delivery? Can you hear me, Henrietta? Henrietta, we might have lost, so I'm going to move on to you, Sophie, to get your perspectives, and then let's see if Henrietta can join us.
Yes, thank you. So when it talks about these things, one that geopolitics is indeed one that right now is on a lot of people's mind because it's on the front page of the paper. I agree very much with Volker that when you have challenges like this, it is sometimes more wise to focus on the things that we have in common. And personally, I think the issue of climate change and climate action is actually where all countries are going to suffer, and at national level, at local government, at local level, businesses, citizens, farmers, everyone. So I think the point about where we can find a common ground, I think, is climate change. And I'm very much hopeful that the COP26 will also be that moment where we can get more ambition and more action together and focus on ways that where we can have common ground to move forward. Specifically on the cities and local governments, it's the same. It's the old and the young. It's the big business. It's the small, medium enterprises. It's the national governments. It's the cities. It's the big countries. It's the small countries. The key is about making sure that small or young is not becoming a reason for exclusion, right? So let me give some examples. When we work in Women Business, we work with one of our partners, CDP, and they also have a program not only for disclosure and accountability for businesses, but also for cities. And another organization called C40 has a network of 40 cities around the world. And as your report already mentioned as an example, they were the ones when Corona started who were able to mobilize a lot of their cities and build up the local capacity on how to deal with it. And they will also be the ones, I think, who can really play that role in climate. But you see the same with businesses. IKEA, global company, they have committed to zero emissions urban freight in all the cities where they deliver around the world. And they took the cities because they had concrete solution, electric vehicles. And they started with 5 cities, including Shanghai, Amsterdam, and various others. And by 2025, they're going to have this across cities around the world. So it's also for big businesses. It is often cities where they end up taking a lot of the concrete action. I would like to see this expanded to the young, and I'm very much, your enthusiasm, Akansha, is really contagious. I really like it. And I sometimes wonder why do we only give young people the right to vote when they're 18? I mean, I've got 2 teenagers at home and they have super strong political views, but yet they're not allowed to vote about their own future until much later. So capacity also is with the young people, trying to get them more aware, not just about the problem of climate change in schools, but also about how to solve it. And I think right now, a lot of the capacity building is too much focused on the problem and too little on the solution, too much about the theory and too little about active involvement to get them to do and to learn by doing. So I think that if we get a more focus on that, then we would really get a lot more progress. Thank you.
Thanks, Sophie. And a call to young people to have the vote under 18. I think that will meet with some support from many quarters. Akansha, what's your perspectives on where you see these figures? Does this ring true to you from your perspective as a youth activist?
So I'm really glad you brought up local governance, because as you know, in the UK this past week, we've actually had local elections, and very exciting time for a politics geek like me. But I actually think, yeah, local governance does not get enough attention that it deserves. If anything, local governance will impact the way people live their life day to day, and it probably will affect people's lives more than global governance in some aspects. So I think there definitely needs to be more conversation and focus on local governance. And the UK is quite unique in the sense that it obviously has devolved powers, but it is still very London-centric. And I think you can see the G7 summit, actually they're having it in Cornwall instead of London, which many people might have expected. So I think there are efforts to go, to divert from the whole London-centric view. From the sort of Y7 perspective, what we try to do this year for the first time is we've recruited youth forum members. So we really recognise the importance of regional representation. So we've recruited various young people from across the UK so that they can input, again, their perspectives from their regions and their unique experiences into helping the youth delegates form the policy recommendations. And I think countries are starting to recognise the intersection between having the importance of youth, but also youth from across the country. So for example, in Canada, they have the Youth Advisory Council, and I think they recruit youth from across the country. And of course, Canada is a huge country, but with lots of communities affected by various different policies. So I think that's really important to see the intersection of youth and regional representation.
Thanks so much, Akansha. I think, Henrietta, we're going to try you to see whether your internet gremlins have left you, and you can join us for the final thought. I don't know if you saw the Slido there.
I did. The one that had geopolitics right in the center, or was the other one, a second one?
Yes, right, that's it.
Renata, I just left as you asked the question about local government, and I think I really want to congratulate you on the Chatham House. And I actually like the concept you have in there of subnational arrangements, which I think includes local government and governance. And I think it is a really important factor. I think it's a way of putting into practice the idea that good governance begins at home. And I think from a global South perspective, which is very much my think, the inequality or the lack of power of global South voices in global fora, I think can be addressed in a large part by strengthening local engagement, by strengthening local arrangements. Volker, it's such a pity he had to leave. He talked about how fear is often a barrier to governments embracing more inclusive, multi-stakeholder approaches. And I think that what I'd like to see governments do, particularly Global South governments, is to embrace more inclusion at the local level and strengthening decision-making process and participative decision-making processes and implementation partnerships at village level, at provincial level, but also taking those voices into the global processes so that when a government goes to a global fora in New York or Geneva, that they actually speak in partnership with and with the perspectives of local actors. So I do think, I think there are lots of opportunity for that. I think there is an awareness, as Volker said, that we need cooperation between different types of stakeholders, different stakeholder groups, and between the local and the global. But I agree that the potential of these subnational participative efforts really is very important. And I think that's what we've seen in the IGF. I think part of the IGF sustainability has really been through the national and regional initiatives. That's what creates ownership.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Henrietta, for joining from your Lapa, and despite your internet challenges. Colleagues, it's not often that you start a discussion on a pessimistic tone about global challenges and end on a more optimistic tone. And I think that's how our discussion went today. We heard about some of the real challenges, and you, the audience, put in geopolitics front and center. But we also heard how there are so many ranges of different models happening around the world, messy though they are, of different levels, different sectors, different sort of coalitions, trying to find ways to work to achieve impact, to pursue global goods, whether that is on climate, whether that is in digital standards and access, whether that is on having youth inclusion across the range of policy questions. And what I heard very much was, this is not about best practices. This is about test practices. This is about having the scope to make mistakes, that is having the scope to try different things, but to have a constant set of saying we don't have the answers. And that inclusion means constantly asking yourself, who is this for? Who is engaged? Where is the policy outcome? How do we measure it? So I think I heard a call for a lot more sense of measuring, continuing the assessment, and self-awareness as we go ahead, and that there's no sense of any one coalition or any one body being the voice of all bodies. So I think that was a real call for modesty, a call for testing, a call for, perhaps some people called it outcome measurement or impact measurement as we go along. And so that speaks to one of the things that in our report, the Chatham House report, we've tried to do is keep measuring and keep testing some of these experiences on which we can build. I also very much heard this notion that, the global is local. We've heard it in terms of understanding, not just because that's how most people, as Akansha said, experience governance, experience challenges, experience the implications of climate action, positive or negative, or digital governance, but also because that's where people can learn, that's where capacities can be built, that's where networks and foundations and perspectives and testing, as Sophie said, some of the best things happening in climate are happening at local level. So how can we bring that subnational structure to a much more greater capacity engagement? And how can build a case that it's in states' interest, including and notwithstanding the perspective of sovereignty and the perspective of sovereignty being at the center of how we organize our international system. I think the final point that I think I was struck by very much was the fact that inclusion is happening, like it or not. So the question is that it's not going away, and we are going to have to, and states are going to have to find new ways to make that as more effective as possible. So rather than resist, how to think about issues such as funding, how to think about forums, how to think about engagement, so that the case can be made for a value-added capacity and some real new voices and new ideas and new perspectives. I'd like to thank very much our four speakers today, Sophie, Akansha, Henrietta and Volker, who had to leave us there in the final moments. But most of all, I'd like to thank you, our population, our community, our audience, for really getting at the heart of what must be a discussion across climate, digital, SDGs we didn't speak about very much, social development, sustainable development goals, but the wide range of actors that we need to bring together in communities to look at what are the forums and networks for engaging and where can we be effective at the multilateral, the national and the local level. So thank you for your engagement. Please do read our report, Reflections on Inclusive Governance, and some of the insights, and stay engaged on what will be a really critical issue for us going forward. So once again, thank you for joining us today, this Monday, and all the best to everyone. Bye-bye.